What was the Cold War, and how does it still affect us today? The worksheet questions for this PowerPoint go in order of the PowerPoint, but that first question about how this affects us today will be answered throughout. So look out for that word, today, as I say it and as I write it, and that'll help you give a bunch of good examples for that first question as you see them. Let's get started. So to understand the origins of the Cold War, we got to go back to World War II, the big three, leaders of the Allied nations during World War II. Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Great Britain, President Harry Truman of the United States, and Premier Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. Here they are in 1945, pretty sure that they're about to win the war. But as you might expect, there are some serious disagreements between the United States and the Soviet Union. They just did not trust each other. And it didn't help the fact that the United States was about to drop an atomic bomb, really raising the stakes. The Cold War was a decades-long global contest for power between two superpowers, the USA and the USSR. The Cold War lasted from 1945, maybe even a little bit before the end of World War II, until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War divided the world into two teams, communist dictatorship or capitalist democracy. Other countries were forced to choose. So what's up with this conflict? Why couldn't the USSR and the USA just sit down, have some tea, maybe some vodka, and just work it all out, get along? Well, that wasn't going to happen. The USSR wanted the whole world to be communist. Through the lens of Marxist class struggle, they saw the USA as the exploitative, owning class that needed to be destroyed. And they were afraid that the USA would use their capitalist power to dominate other countries and destroy the Soviet Union. Honestly, they were kind of right. The US, on the other hand, was afraid the Soviet Union would take over America, destroy democracy, and end capitalist institutions. They were afraid that if the USSR expanded its influence to other countries, the USA wouldn't be able to sell its consumer goods to people around the world, which is how we were making money. You can see this fear in this US propaganda, right? And all these different propaganda posters. You can see the really powerful symbolism over here on the left of this fist labeled with this hammer and sickle driving a knife into the heart of the United States. Or over here on the right with this flag, the symbol of American liberty and prosperity, up in flames while people are fighting beneath it. There's this really huge fear that communism would be the end of everything that it means to be an American. The Soviet Union had its own propaganda against the United States, mostly focused on how the United States was really greedy and disregarded human rights. Here you can see the Statue of Liberty with her mouth shut. Pretty powerful symbolism that she can't speak, with a lock that's got a money sign on it. Money is keeping her mouth shut. And on top of her, who is that? It's the police. The Soviet Union, as you can see down here on the bottom right, was really critical of the actions of the police in the United States. And then up here in the top right, you are seeing this right. This is the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, who in the 1920s and 1930s were on the rise, this white terrorist organization that was lynching black people, particularly in the South. And so the Soviet Union was seeing this and criticizing the United States for not being a place where people were actually free. Nuclear weapons also really raised the stakes of war. 4 years after the US dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the Soviet Union tested their first atomic bomb. This created a nuclear arms race where both the US and USSR raced to develop and stockpile more and better nuclear bombs and ballistic missiles. This arms race created enough weapons to kill billions and threaten the survival of the human species. Keep in mind that even though the Cold War is over, today we are still in the nuclear age. Kids who grew up in the 1950s experienced this really personally through these duck and cover drills. Today we have fire drills and we even have active shooter drills reflecting the climate of our times. And in this time they had duck and cover drills just in case an atomic bomb exploded nearby. Everybody practiced going underneath their desks to hide from the atomic bomb, as if somehow their desks would prevent them from getting radiation. Despite this constant fear of nuclear war, nobody ever dropped these bombs. It was too risky. If the USA dropped a nuclear bomb, it was almost guaranteed that the Soviets would send a nuclear bomb in return. This idea was powerful. It was called mutually assured destruction. Basically, the fact that both superpowers had nuclear weapons meant that they were both afraid to use them or to provoke the other superpower in a different way because it would likely mean their own destruction. And this is actually why this is called the Cold War, because there were no hot battles fought directly between the Soviet and American troops. I'm going to leave you with this cartoon to analyze that I think shows mutually assured destruction really well, and we'll talk about it in our class meeting. But think about, why do these two teams that both have these powerful bombs only shoot arrows at each other? The world did come alarmingly close to nuclear war in 1961 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which you're going to learn about in your second lesson for this week. You can see here this cartoon of President Kennedy in the US and President Khrushchev in the Soviet Union, or Premier Khrushchev, both arm wrestling, about to press those weapons. Their fingers hovered over the trigger to press those weapons to blow each other up. Like, this was serious, right? Like, people were scared. In the 1970s and 1980s, Russia and the United States realized that it would be beneficial to try to limit the number of nuclear weapons. Here you can see on this y-axis the number of warheads that existed with these two countries and how they start to go down starting in the 70s and 80s, partly due to a series of treaties signed between the two presidents or premiers in the 70s and 80s to limit these weapons. Now, because of the reality of nuclear weapons, the U.S. strategy to win the Cold War was not to attack the Soviet Union directly, but to prevent communism from spreading to other countries. This strategy was called containment. You can see the U.S.'s fears really well in this piece of propaganda, where this octopus that we can tell is supposed to be the Soviet Union because of its hammer and sickle and because its face looks an awful lot like Stalin, is reaching out to these other countries around the world. This propaganda, too, I think is really great at showing that. It's your choice. Where do you draw the line against communist aggression? The idea being that if the U.S. government doesn't draw the line somewhere through their military, through stopping countries from becoming communist, communists would eventually take over the whole world. So if they didn't fight each other directly, how did the USSR and the USA try to control each other during the Cold War? 3 different ways I'll talk about. 1, dividing up control of other countries. 2, through proxy wars. And 3rd, through alliances and international organizations. Let's check out dividing up control of other countries. A great example is Korea, which was occupied by Japan during World War II. So after the war, they decided to divide it up. North Korea was controlled by the Soviet Union and adopted a communist government, and the U.S. controlled South Korea, which adopted a democracy similar to the United States. And the Korean Peninsula remains divided today. Germany also was divided into 4 zones: the American, French, British, and Russian. Remember, Germany lost the war, so they were kind of subject to whatever the Allies wanted to do with them. This became 2 totally different worlds. East Germany over here was communist under Soviet control, while West Germany, all of this part, was a capitalist democracy propped up by the United States. One country divided into 2 totally different systems. The city of Berlin, over here in the Soviet zone, was also divided up into these different zones. The division of Germany caused tension between the US and USSR after the war. Each superpower wanted to rebuild Germany in their own way. The USA sent aid to Germany as part of the Marshall Plan. They hoped that supporting the German economy and government would keep Germans from, quote, turning to communism. Here you can see some American servicemen offering aid to people. Now think about this. Remember what happened to Germany after World War I, where Germany fell into huge debt and economic problems because of the Treaty of Versailles and all the costs of the war, and then they supported Hitler, who became a fascist, who then went to take over other countries in Europe? Let's not do that again. The Marshall Plan, a little more about it, was about stopping the spread of communism by sending aid, $15 billion total, so it wasn't cheap, to Western Europe. Stalin was not happy about this. So unhappy, in fact, that he built the Berlin Wall, this wall that divided up the city of Berlin in between East and West. The people on the east side, that was Soviet-controlled, couldn't go through and visit people they knew on the western side of the city, and the city remained divided for 30 years. This caused Winston Churchill, who is now no longer the Prime Minister of Great Britain, to say that an iron curtain has descended across the continent, which really raised the stakes of the Cold War. Dividing control of other countries continued. Japan was also devastated by World War II, of course, and led by General Douglas MacArthur, the United States occupied Japan after World War II, rewrote their constitution, and set up a new government. From 1948 to 1950, the U.S. poured money and resources into Japan, just like it did in Germany. The idea was that if people are poor, they might be more drawn to communism, in which workers have control and resources are shared. But then if people have a consumerist economy and they see the USA as an ally, they'd be a little more invested in capitalism. This is the logic behind the Marshall Plan. The USA intervention helped set Japan up as the second largest economy in the post-war world. And it's no coincidence that the biggest car manufacturers today outside the United States are Germany and Japan. The U.S. supported their economies the most after World War II. You can look at this cute little 1950s Nissan. The Soviet Union did this also. They didn't want to be invaded again from the West, and they were in World War II by Germany, so they took control of buffer states, countries allied with the USSR to the west of them. As a result, these Eastern European countries, which included Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Ukraine, became communist and allies of the Soviet Union. The USA and USSR rarely fought each other directly. Instead, they fought each other through third parties. These wars were called proxy wars. We're going to talk about 3 proxy wars: in Korea, in Vietnam, and over here in Afghanistan. Let's start with Korea. From 1950 to 1953, the U.S. sent troops to defend South Korea in the Korean War. The USSR sent material, medical supplies, and fighter jets to support the communist North Korea and their Chinese allies. Later, in Vietnam, the U.S. sent American soldiers to fight this long, drawn-out war against North Vietnamese communists. Like in Korea, the Soviet Union supported its North Vietnamese allies with tanks, missiles, and other weapons. And then in the 1980s in Afghanistan, when armed groups in Afghanistan fought against their communist government, the USSR intervened to support the Afghan government in what the U.S. called an invasion. The United States supported the rebels, a group called the Mujahideen, by sending weapons covertly. Here you see President Reagan meeting with members of the Mujahideen. Now, the Mujahideen later became the Taliban, who the U.S. fought against in the Afghanistan war starting in 2001. There are still troops in Afghanistan today fighting against the Taliban or dealing with the aftermath of that war, a group which the United States in the 1980s, in this big form of historical irony, actually funded. More proxy wars. Throughout the Cold War, the U.S. intervened in countries around the world to prevent communist governments from coming to power. The U.S. deposed leaders, funded civil wars, and supported dictators, sometimes openly, sometimes in secret. Let's take a look at some of these interventions, starting in Latin America. In the Central American countries of Nicaragua and El Salvador, the United States opposed left-wing governments and movements. For instance, in Nicaragua, the CIA secretly funded and trained the Contras, an armed right-wing group that fought against the leftist Nicaraguan government and was accused of terrible human rights abuses. Basically, the U.S. stepped into these people's civil war. And this wasn't the only time. Across Latin America, throughout the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, the United States intervened in the affairs of these different countries. Panama, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Chile, Paraguay, Brazil are all good examples. In Guatemala, the CIA secretly orchestrated the overthrow of democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz and replaced him with this guy, Carlos Castillo Armas, a dictator who imprisoned, executed, and tortured his political enemies. This was common for the United States to come in and support one political leader over another, a political leader that supported the interests of the United States. In Chile, similarly, in 1973, the CIA supported a coup d'etat, a military overthrow of this guy, democratically elected President Salvador Allende, a socialist who wanted to reclaim Chilean resources from American companies. After firebombing the presidential palace, the USA helped replace Allende with this guy, Augusto Pinochet, an oppressive dictator who disappeared thousands of people. Today, Chile still lives with the constitution that was written during Pinochet's era, and massive protests in the fall of 2019 have led to a demand for a new constitution and a referendum on a new constitution that's currently just being delayed by the coronavirus. And these sorts of things didn't just happen in Latin America. In Iran, in 1953, the CIA and Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, the M16, staged a coup d'etat to remove elected President Mohammad Mossadegh, who wanted to nationalize Iran's oil, which was controlled by a British oil company. They replaced him with this guy, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who amassed billions in oil wealth for himself while Iranians grew poorer. This set the stage for the Iranian Revolution of 1979, a massive protest movement that ended up with an anti-American fundamentalist Islamic government led by Ayatollah Khomeini, the same government that's in power today. The model for U.S. intervention during the Cold War. The U.S. propped up dictators, funded civil wars, deposed leaders, and used other kinds of power to keep communists, or those that they accused of being communist, from getting into power. They did this as well in Cambodia, in Poland, in Angola in the 1980s, in the Congo, and in Israel. Now, looking at this map, you can tell that the Cold War had global effects, totally transformed the trajectory of all of these different countries in ways that people are still dealing with today. The question here was the US really just trying to stop the Soviet Union? Or was this a new version of imperialism, used to protect their own business interests? We'll look at this a little bit later in future lessons. The Soviets did this too. They launched similar interventions in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Here's Lech Walesa, who organized the Solidarity trade union movement of workers in Poland in the 1970s and 1980s, after being fired as a dock worker. He was arrested for his activity by the Soviet-backed government, and he later became the first president of Democratic Poland in 1990. Let's take a look at some alliances and international organizations now, which were some ways that the Cold War was battled out. Let's start with the UN, which you have probably heard of. It's an international organization founded in October of 1945 with the goal of preserving peace through international cooperation and collective security. Remember, World War II had just ended, and nobody was trying to do that again. Today, almost every country is a member of the UN. There are 6 main bodies, with their headquarters mostly located in New York City. Some important ones are the General Assembly, where all the member states can vote, and a Security Council that tries to resolve conflict, condemn conflicts, and send peacekeeping troops to places around the world. The UN also governs many agencies, and some of these you may have heard of. The International Monetary Fund, which loans money to various countries, UNESCO, which promotes preservation of cultural heritage sites, the World Health Organization, which promotes global health initiatives, and UNICEF, which defends children's rights and saves children's lives worldwide. Today, you can see over here on the right the influence of the World Health Organization in fighting COVID-19 through one of their most important initiatives right now. Let's take a look also at the Security Council. As you can imagine, in the United Nations, the United States had a lot of power. Here's the UN Security Council. It's made up of all these different member states. These ones rotate, but these 5 always stay the same. They always serve on the Security Council. Who are they? The UK, the United States, China, Russia, and France. No big coincidence, those are the countries that won World War II. And all of these countries not only stay on the Security Council, they get veto power. That means if one of them doesn't like a resolution that the Security Council is making, it doesn't happen. Now you can imagine that with the United States and Russia, or the Soviet Union, on the same Security Council, there'd be a lot of disagreement, and that definitely happened. You can see that the USSR, over here, voted no, veto, the most out of anybody on the UN. Another alliance was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which also still exists today. Founded in 1949 by the United States, Canada, and several other allies as a form of protection against the Soviet Union. Now 30 member countries in North America and Europe are part of it. And this is not about peace. This is about protection. This is an alliance of mutual defense. These member countries' spending on their militaries make up 70% of all military spending worldwide. This is just in case the Soviet Union attacks us, we've got somebody on our back. Now, Trump has recently been criticizing NATO. He threatened to pull out of NATO unless other countries begin to spend more money on their militaries and contribute more. So, it's still a dynamic in the world today. The Soviet Union made their own military alliance called the Warsaw Pact in 1955, but it doesn't exist anymore. How did the Cold War affect global power? During the Cold War, there was this idea that the world was divided into 3 separate worlds. The first world was the USA and its closest allies. The second world, the USSR and its closest allies. And the third world was everybody else. This was sometimes called, quote, underdeveloped economies. Now, we don't really use the term third world anymore. It's seen as inaccurate because not all of these countries are even poor. For example, Saudi Arabia is one of the richest countries in the world. Why is it here? And it's an insulting way to label countries run by people of color as backwards and inferior. However, this idea of 3 worlds is helpful in understanding the fact that the third world countries really had to choose. United States or Soviet Union. This was the choice for most of the 20th century. There's particular pressure on countries newly independent from generations of European colonization, that period of imperialism that we learned about. This was most African countries who gained their independence in the late 1950s and 1960s, Southeast Asia, which included Vietnam in the 1950s, and India in 1948. So, who won the Cold War? Well, so in the early Cold War, it really looked like the Soviet Union could beat the United States. They sent the first satellite into space called Sputnik. They sent the first man into space, and even the first dog into space. And I'm sorry to report that she did not survive. Plus, in 1949, China became communist, which made the U.S. really nervous about communism in Asia. One of the reasons that the U.S. got involved in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Actually, it's the main reason. And then here we have Chairman Mao smiling above the people in China's own powerful propaganda. But by the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union just couldn't keep up. Why? First of all, the state-run economies of communism were less efficient and less popular. The USSR could not produce as much as the United States. It led to famine and inefficiency. And plus, people just like to have choices. Capitalism offers you a variety of consumer goods, and in communism, you just get what the government gives you. Plus, people don't really like authoritarianism. So how did the Cold War finally end? The Soviet Union was declining in power and facing a lot of economic and political problems during the 1970s and 1980s. In the 1980s, Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev began opening up the economy for the first time. He introduced economic reforms with capitalist elements to create more efficiency, and he ended some restrictions on free speech in the press, two policies called Glasnost and Perestroika. With censorship lifted, people in the Soviet Union realized how much poorer people in the Second World were than the First World. With this new freedom, people began criticizing the Soviet Union openly for the first time in 3 generations, without punishment. And this led to these revolutions of 1989. Gorbachev's policies unleashed protest movements in the USSR and the Eastern Bloc states demanding democracy and independence. The first ones were in Poland, followed by Hungary and Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution, which divided up Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, peacefully. This is also when we see the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1991 in Germany. This kind of spontaneous protest movement around the wall arose where people literally started pulling chunks out of the wall and tearing it down. And Gorbachev decided to do nothing. Here we see some Soviet-affiliated soldiers of East Germany staring through into West Berlin for the first time. This was a huge moment where people could now cross this iron curtain that seemed so uncrossable. And these movements were largely peaceful, except in Romania. The USSR really didn't put up a fight to this new opening up. Also, 1991 is when I was born. So with this, the Cold War and the Soviet Union itself were no more. So what's up with Russia now? Russia transitioned to capitalism with a bang! Starting in 1992, Russia transitioned to a capitalist market economy with something called shock therapy. The transition was rough. Hyperinflation nearly bankrupted Russia's industries, and stabilization policies of high taxes and high interest rates led to widespread depression among Russian people. Also, a capitalist economy produces winners and losers. Entrepreneurs and previous black market businesses grew super wealthy. And this created a new class of oligarchs. These are super rich people who had undemocratic control over government affairs. This nation, previously this huge, like the biggest communist nation in the world, then finally transitions into capitalism. Meanwhile, while some of these oligarchs are growing so rich, many elderly, people with fixed incomes, and people on pensions saw their incomes drop and their savings wiped out. Also, almost 30 years after transitioning to a capitalist democracy, Russia isn't really a democracy. This is Vladimir Putin, who you probably recognize, or at least know his name. He was first elected to prime minister in 2000 and held control of the Russian government for 20 years. This is the longest serving leader since Stalin. He's filled parliament with people who support him. Putin's dismantled the independent media and limited press freedoms in Russia, so that period of openness is now much less open. His government has imprisoned activists, cracked down on journalists, and increased violence against LGBTQ people. Putin's also been accused of leading widespread disinformation campaigns to interfere in the 2016 U.S. presidential election in favor of Donald Trump, something that Trump denies happened. In March 2020, Putin led a constitutional amendment that would allow him to stay in power until 2036. Not really democratic. For 45 years, 2 superpowers controlled the world and kept each other in check, forcing everybody to choose, or at least to create a third way. But now, without the Soviet Union present anymore, we have this kind of multipolar system. It's not really clear who's going to come out on top, who's going to exert their power, and how they're going to be able to do that. In retrospect, it can seem silly, this fear of communism that's going to completely destroy everything we know, or these world leaders that are poised with their fingers on the trigger to launch nuclear missiles over these ideological differences. think it's important to remember the context of the time, that this is what people knew, and that this is the reality that they were facing, these fears. But it's also important to realize that when the Berlin Wall was built, it was hard to tell if it would ever come down. For a lot of people, it was impossible to imagine a world without this Soviet versus American clash of civilizations. Let that be a reminder that even the biggest systems and the strongest walls, even if it seems impossible, can still come down.